Americans now have the highest debt in U.S. history. According to the Federal Reserve, Americans collectively owe over $1 trillion in credit debt.
I think the greatest threat domestically to the country is this $21 trillion debt hanging over the cloud of America and future generations. And the fact that interest rates are going up, we're going to be paying close to over $400 billion in interest expense, which I think is the number one or number two issue in terms of federal expense to the country.
You say that a huge sell-off is coming, the biggest in my lifetime. When is it coming? First of all, that's the first question. When?
Later this year or next, the decline will start in. But it doesn't happen in a day. And Stuart, when I said it's going to be the biggest market downturn in my lifetime, I mean, that's not so strange to me. 2008, we had a problem because of too much debt. Stuart, as you well know, the debt has skyrocketed since 2008. So when I say it's going to be worse than my lifetime, how could it not be?
And I think that the crisis that is coming is going to be a dollar crisis, and it's going to be a sovereign debt crisis. That's the only way that this thing is going to end. And if it happens in the next several years, which is very possible. So we're now running approximately $100 billion a month deficits in the United States. That's $1.2 trillion a year and rising, right? Because as interest rates are going up, the cost of financing the debt keeps going up, in addition to the fact that the debt is going up because we're borrowing more money. But this is basically more borrowing than we did under Obama during the height of the Great Recession, 2009, 2010, that time frame. And the economy, in theory anyway, isn't even in recession, yet we're borrowing all this money. The U.S. government, I think, in this next fiscal year is going to spend $5 trillion for the first time in history, to be a $5 trillion in government spending. So government spending is off the charts, borrowing is off the charts. Not only are the budget deficits exploding, but the trade deficits are record highs as well.
Today, America is nearly $70 trillion in debt, and that debt is shooting higher at an exponential rate. Usually most of the focus is on the national debt, which is now $21 trillion and rising. But when you total all forms of debt in our society together, it comes to a grand total just short of $70 trillion. Many people seem to believe that the debt imbalances that existed prior to the great financial crisis of 2008 have been solved, but that is not the case at all. We are living in the terminal phase of the greatest debt bubble in history, and with each passing day, that mountain of debt just keeps on getting bigger and bigger. It simply is not mathematically possible for debt to keep on growing at a pace that is many times greater than GDP growth, and at some point this absurd bubble will come to an abrupt end. Let's talk about the consumer debt first. Excluding mortgage debt, consumer debt is projected to hit the $4 trillion mark by the end of the year. Americans are in the borrowing mood, and their total tab for consumer debt could reach a record $4 trillion by the end of 2018. That's according to LendingTree, a loan comparison website which analyzed data from the Federal Reserve on non-mortgage debts, including credit cards and also personal and student loans. Americans owe more than 26% of their annual income to this debt. That's up from 22% in 2010. It's also higher than debt levels during the mid-2000s, where credit availability soared. We have never seen this level of consumer debt before in all of US history. Just a few days ago, I wrote about how tens of millions of Americans are living on the edge financially, and there is yet more evidence to back up that claim. Americans owe more than $1 trillion on auto loans, and we are clearly in the greatest auto loan debt bubble than we have ever seen. Americans also owe more than $1 trillion on their credit cards, and credit card delinquency rates are rising. In fact, in some ways, that we witnessed during the first quarter of 2018 was quite reminiscent of the peak of the last financial crisis. In the first quarter, the delinquency rate on credit card loan balances at commercial banks other than the largest 100, so at the 4,788 smaller banks in the US, spiked in to 5.9%. This exceeds the peak during the financial crisis. The student loan debt bubble has also surpassed $1 trillion, and the average young adult with student loan debt has a negative net worth. Despite economic and stock market gains over the past 9 years, many young adults are still struggling to get ahead in their financial lives, and, in some ways, things may have actually gotten worse. Americans aged 25 to 34 with college degrees and student debt have a median net wealth of a negative $1,900, according to a report analyzing the 2016 Federal Reserve data released Thursday by Young Invincibles, a young adult advocacy group. That's a drop of 9,000 from 2013. Why else? Analysis found. Meanwhile, corporate debt has doubled since the last financial crisis. Thousands of companies are so highly leveraged that even a slight economic downturn could completely wipe them out. State and local government debt levels are also at record highs, but nobody seems to care. And if we never have another recession, everything might work out okay. The biggest offender of all, of course, is the United States federal government. We have been adding about $1 trillion a year to the national debt since Barack Obama first entered the White House, and Goldman Sachs is projecting that number will surpass $2 trillion by 2028. The fiscal outlook for the United States is not good, according to Goldman Sachs, and could pose a threat to the country's economic security during the next recession. According to forecasts from the bank's chief economists, the federal deficit will increase from $825 billion, or 4.1% of gross domestic product, to $1.25 trillion, 5.5% of GDP, by 2021. And by 2028, the bank expects the number to balloon to $2.05 trillion, 7% of GDP. Our national debt has been growing at an exponential rate for decades, and because total disaster has not struck yet, many people seem to believe that we can keep on doing this. But the truth is, that is simply not possible. There is only so much debt that a society can take on before the entire system implodes. So how close are we to that point? The following chart comes from Charles Hugh Smith, and it shows the exponential rise in overall debt levels that has taken us to the brink of nearly $70 trillion in debt. And this next chart, from the SRS Rocco reports, shows how our rate of overall debt growth has compared to our rate of GDP growth. We are literally on a path to national suicide. Whether it happens next month, next year, or 5 years from now, it is inevitable that we are going to slam into a brick wall of financial reality. For the moment, the only way that we can continue to enjoy our current debt-fueled standard of living is to continue increasing our debt bubble at an exponential rate. But that can only go on for so long, and when the party ends, we are going to experience the greatest debt crisis in history. Today, the average American household is nearly $140,000 in debt, and that is more than double median household's income. And if we were to include each household share of corporate debt, local government debt, state government debt, and federal government debt, that number would be many times higher. All of this debt will never be repaid. Ultimately, there will come a day when the system will completely collapse under the weight of so much debt. And most Americans are completely unaware that such a day of reckoning is rapidly approaching.